Okay, welcome to the third annual Blue and Green Seminar Series. This is a collaboration between Altasea in the Port of Los Angeles, Cal State University Northridge's Institute for Sustainability, the Los Angeles Coalition for the Economy and Jobs, and Santa Monica College. Today's webinar is the first of 4 events this month that convene experts in aquaculture and sustainability to shine a spotlight on this emerging aquaculture sector in the blue economy. This series reimagines the relationships between businesses, universities, government, nonprofits, and communities. And today, we are fortunate to have panelists who are all in some way use cultivation of marine organisms to improve coastal environmental quality on scales from local to global. And we'll be having a conversation about working at that intersection between conservation and aquaculture. I'll be your moderator. I'm Janet Kübler. I'm a marine biologist researching climate change resilience in seaweeds and seaweed-dominated ecosystems at Cal State University Northridge. And I'm one of the co-founders of the California Seaweed Festival. Our panelists are Leslie Booher, founder of Sunken Seaweed, the first company with a regenerative ocean farm in the water in California. Their work has been funded by the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation as they research how to benefit ecosystems through aquaculture. Our next panelist is Nancy Caruso, founder of Get Inspired. Nancy has spent decades experiencing, I just saw an interesting thing go by there. There it is, okay. Just bubbling up through the kelp forest. It made me very happy. Okay. Nancy Caruso is founder of Get Inspired, and she has decades of experience restoring kelp forests in California and teaching many thousands of people to cultivate kelp and animals that live in kelp forests. And our third panelist is Eger, founder and program director of the Kelp Forest Alliance. He's the lead author of the Kelp Restoration Guidebook. I'm going to give each one of these panelists opportunity to tell us something about their work and give us some context, and then we'll open up for questions. You can post your questions under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you have access to the chat, you can put them in there, or you can put them in the comments on Facebook Live. Okay, so anytime you're ready, Leslie, I'm going to hear about Sunken Seaweed.
Great. Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you to everyone that's facilitating this, putting this on. I really appreciate this multi-part webinar series. I think it's going to be a really informative series, and I'm giddy to hear about what the others have to say. But like Janet said, sorry, just getting
No problem.
Getting this going. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, I guess you three. So like Janet said, my name is Leslie Booher. I'm approximately one half of Sunken Seaweed with my partner, Tori Polizzi, who's also my husband. And our company was founded in 2017. So several years ago is when we got started down in San Diego. And very recently we've expanded to come up north, way up north to Humboldt Bay as well. So I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview of how we got started because seaweed farming is unique. So Tori and I met in Humboldt here, going to Cal Poly Humboldt back when it was Humboldt State. We had the chance to work kind of as undergrad technicians surveying the rocky intertidal, as well as some of the benthic ecosystems from the North Coast to California. And we were there at a really pivotal time. 2015 was when we kind of wrapped up, but I'm sure a lot of you are aware, we were there, we were surveying kelp forest ecosystems and the intertidal during a time of pretty massive collapse. So on the left, you can see this visualization of the perfect storm that occurred, which is a series of events and factors that led to what you can see on the right, which was a pretty substantial die-off of kelp forests between 2008 and 2016. So, as young budding ecologists, we were kind of just frantic of like, what do we do? Like our ecosystem that we want to study and survey forever is kind of in collapse. So that led us to kind of a course shift when we graduated with our degrees in marine ecology. And we kind of stumbled into seaweed farming, thanks in large part to Greenwave, the nonprofit that's really facilitating kelp forests around the US. So what Greenwave kind of offered really resonated with us. The symbiotic kind of ecosystem-based design was something that we wanted to recreate here in California, of course, using native species along our own coastline. And so we found out through a year or two of digging where we could do this, that San Diego was a location that was pretty amenable to seaweed aquaculture, much more so than what we were finding in other parts of the state. And so we partnered with the Port of San Diego, as Janet mentioned, I think, back in 2017, and they facilitated our very first pilot scale seaweed farm. And I like to use this picture because it shows you that the location of our seaweed farm is in a super urban area. So it's in San Diego Bay, which, if you're familiar, millions of people live right on top of that bay. We've got cruise ships downtown, lots and lots of military presence, and just tons of use of this urban waterway. So this was where we got started seaweed farming. And just a quick picture of what that looked like. We installed our farm, super small 1/4 acre pilot scale, down at this Grape Street pier, this kind of out of use pier. We threw in a bunch of seaweed lines. We looked at reds, greens, and kelp. We looked at giant kelp in that site. We partnered with the university down there, San Diego State, and set up a kelp hatchery so that we could grow baby kelps and deploy them, and really just monitored what the heck was going on when we tried to grow seaweeds in this urban environment. And something great that sprang from that is we figured out that some seaweeds, particularly sea lettuce, which is not a kelp, but they grew super well in this very urban, high input area, especially during really wet winters, which are rare in California, but we had a couple of back-to-back El Niños, and we found out that in the presence of, really low salinities, so heavy fresh water, that this sea lettuce could sequester loads and loads of phosphorus and nitrogen from the water column. So, this concept of bioremediation really is kind of what steered us down in San Diego, because we just were seeing more and more that the opportunity for seaweed aquaculture in the Bay was really for ecosystem services like remediation of nutrients. So that was funded in large part by the Department of Energy through their Mariner kind of program, where they fund seaweed-based research. And then that question, knowing that seaweeds could be used for bioremediation, that prompted us to take our seaweeds, our kind of superstar, this ulva, vibrant green guy, to partner up with a aquaculture facility that specializes in finfish. So we partnered with Hubs SeaWorld, who's in northern San Diego, Carlsbad, and they grow fish from, from egg, basically. They grow them out to fingerlings, and then they put this white sea bass is the species back out into the ocean where their populations are kind of decimated from fishing. So we partnered with this group Hubs and had their fish tanks, effluent water, so nutrient-rich effluent water, flow right into these seaweed tanks. And what we saw was really astounding. You know, it obviously lots of great nitrogen led to heavy seaweed growth. But it also, there were lots of ecosystem services that we monitored, like buffering the pH, oxygenating the water, and removing that heavy nitrogen load before it went back into the ocean. So, you know, those are just a couple of the projects that we really looked at, but I'm happy to talk more about some of the other projects. I just don't have time yet. But yeah, most recently we're up in Humboldt, and we're partnered with, not partnered with, but working under kind of subleasing space from Hog Island Oyster Company. So there's this other great opportunity to look at seaweed growth and bivalve growth and how the many ways those two industries can benefit each other. So that's where we're at right now. And thank you guys all for being here.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Leslie. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions already. I have questions. But I want to move on and get the background from Nancy Caruso and hear about Get Inspired.
All right. Let's pull this up here. Are you able to see my slideshow there?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, my name is Nancy Caruso. I'm a marine biologist and founder of Get Inspired. I've worked in aquaculture and around aquaculture for the last 30 years. I fortunately went to a school that had aquaculture as a major for students at the Florida Institute of Technology back in the 1990s. So I studied aquaculture and marine biology. Oops. I run Get Inspired, and we have a few programs centered around aquaculture, aquaponics, which is of course a great way to teach students about aquaculture and growing food, especially here in Southern California where we don't have farms anymore, but also in Orange County's ocean restoration projects, in which we use aquaculture for education and for coastal restoration. So the aquaponics programs I have in about 32 different schools, and I just actually delivered tilapia this morning to a school. The students were so excited. The marine projects I work on evolve around restoring giant kelp forests, white sea bass, green abalone, and pismo clams. And the goals of these projects are to educate students about aquaculture and marine ecology, involve the community, create ocean stewards, and of course to restore species along our coast. So the first project I started working on was in 2002, which was a kelp forest restoration project. At that time, the Southern California coast had lost 80% of its kelp forest, and Orange County specifically had lost 90% of its kelp forest. And this is what our reefs look like. A similar picture to what we see in Northern California, unfortunately, at this time. Luckily, we don't have urchin barrens in Orange County anymore. We picked up about 1.5 million urchins over a 10-year period. I trained 287 volunteers to come out and dive with me. We weren't allowed to smash them at that time, so literally picked them up one by one and monitored the reefs for algae, invertebrates, fishes, and also picked up the urchins. And then we planted kelp. I taught 5,000 kids how to grow it in their classrooms. And we planted it out on the reefs on very high-tech equipment. You can see these are just pieces of porcelain tile and rubber bands. And it did work. As you can see, we planted them when they were only about 4 or 5 millimeters in height. And you can see this beautiful blade there that's starting to even overgrow the tile and start touching the reef, which is how we got the restoration accomplished. So not an easy task. It's not a, plant a seed, walk away, but it took us 10 years. And now I'm happy to say, after our warm water blob and the El Nino, that our kelp did come back after being gone, from 1983 to 2002, when we started restoration. We had a disruption event, which I was waiting for to find out if our kelp would come back after that blob and El Nino event, and it indeed did. So I'm happy to say that it's back into its natural cycles. Once the kelp forests were restored, we started working on some other programs. I thought this is such a great model to work in schools and involve the community. I partnered up with Hubs as well, just like Leslie. And Hubs has been doing, they're a major player in aquaculture in our country. And so they had been doing white sea bass restocking for about 20 years at that point. And I said, I would love to do this in classrooms. Can I start growing them in schools? They said, fantastic. Just build the systems, we'll give you the fish. So I have now built 6 systems in Orange County. This is one of them at Huntington Beach High School, where the kids have been raising the fish since 2011. We just got some actually yesterday in schools. It's been a late batch year for white sea bass, but we release them twice a year. And this year, it'll be 4,000 kids that have raised fish and released them along the coast of Orange County. It's a fantastic program to introduce students to all facets of aquaculture. And of course, they get to actually grow and release the fish. So it's a full circle story for restoration. You can see how happy they are. So the kids actually go out in the water and put the fish directly in the water. All the fish, if you're not familiar, are tagged from Hubs. So if you catch a white sea bass, we can actually check them for tags to see where they came from. And we're getting to that point now where they might start actually coming from the schools when they're being caught, because they're probably legal size now. But you can see what a joy that is for students to partake in something that's literally changing the world. The next species I started working on was, of course, abalone. Once we have kelp forest back, we started looking at this species, which historically was a little bit over harvested. The abalone, if you're not familiar, most people do know what dead abalone look like, unfortunately, but the live ones often get overlooked. They kind of look like rocks, but we have 7 species here in Southern California, and that range all the way up to Alaska, some of them, and down into Baja. 2 of them on the endangered species list, and the rest are in some sort of decline, either threatened or on the species of concern list. And for people who've not lived it during the time period when we had abalone, it's difficult to understand how many we had. So I often show these photos of abalone processing plants along the California coast from the 1930s and 40s. Yeah, these guys are laying on piles of shells. These guys are laying on piles of shells. The commercial limit for abalone was 1,440 per day per fisherman. So we had a lot of abalone. Yeah, there's the wow symbol there. Yes, we had a lot of abalone, and we simply don't anymore. So densities are very low, and that's what's contributed to starting this restoration project. So another 87 divers have been trained to go out and survey and outplant abalone. And we are working on a proposal right now to start a new outplanting batch with some abalone that we've raised on a partner aquaculture farm up in Goleta, California. This was Carlsbad, where Leslie actually works too. They used to raise abalone. They don't raise them anymore, but this was a picture taken down at Carlsbad Aqua Farms. And over 3,000 kids have worked on growing abalone in their classrooms. This is really big deal because most people under 40 don't even know what an abalone is. So that's what that looks like. This is my batch in my hand there. The biggest ones are 7 years old. They're getting ready to go in the ocean, hopefully next year. And the last species I'm working on is the pismo clam. I was hearing lots of stories about pismo clams, and I realized I'd never seen one. Well, lo and behold, we seem to have eaten all of those too. So I've trained another 100 volunteers in the last couple of years to go out and survey clams. We actually have a survey tomorrow at a negative tide. And we're trying to assess the population, how many are left, what's their size. And last year, in a partnership with Holdfast Aquaculture, which is right there at Altasea, we became the first in the world to ever spawn and settle pismo clams. So here's our little baby pictures. I thought you might be interested. I carry them around in my wallet. And I can't wait to answer any questions for you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And, as always, inspired. I always feel inspired listening to you. Okay, so I really am anxious to get to where we can all talk about these things, but we really need to get our third panelist out here with his inspiring stories. So Aaron, Eger, let's hear about the Kelp Forest Alliance.
I will be between you and the question period. Get that swapped over. But thank you so much, Janet, for inviting me and organizing. And thank you to all the other panelists. Nancy, I've read lots of your reports in the past, so it's great to hear you present from that. Nice walk. This. There we go. See the title screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So I will be the global perspective to this. I'm going to be talking to you about a project called the Kelp Forest Alliance and kelp forest conservation and restoration all around the world. And just as a bit of a stock take before we go into this, and we're all likely on the kelp bandwagon in the room and we love our kelp forest, but I think even within the community, there's sometimes a tendency to get lost in just how important kelp really is. So we have kelp forests across about a third of our coastline, and that's within 50 kilometers of 750 million people. And that really makes it, what I would argue, the most important biological marine habitat. And at the same time, it's increasingly threatened. And the new UN report that's coming out later this year pegs it at about 40 to 60% of kelp forests have been degraded over the last 50 years. And that's through a combination of overharvest, too many sea urchins, warming seawater, toxic pollution, industrial development, coastal development, and the such. And this loss is then not only directly threatening the cultural and ecological significance of kelp forests, but also the economic value. So we have some new research coming out that's starting to assess how much a kelp forest is worth each year, what the value of a kelp forest is to society. And those values are starting to look at about $64,000 to $150,000 per hectare per year. And that's through fisheries, carbon capture, and nutrient cycling. And so these threats then have quite significant consequences beyond the ecological, beyond the social, and into the economic as well. And in response to that, we're now starting to see the growth of a global kelp restoration movement. So some of my past work has been creating a database of kelp restoration projects around the world and starting to see how we're doing, why we're doing restoration, what the outcomes are. And we're pretty much getting kelp forest restoration projects everywhere that has a kelp forest, except South Africa, just because they haven't seen such big declines. But through that, we're also seeing that a lot of these projects are very small scale. So it's quite early days in the field. And if you look at it, about 80% of projects that we recorded were less than a hectare in size. And so we're not at the point, or not even really getting close to the point where most projects are restoring kelp forests at the scales that they've been lost. And then similarly, we find that kelp forests aren't super well protected. So only about 2 to 3% of canopy forming kelp forests are protected in some sort of marine protected area of significance all across the world. And so we think about how we want to increase restoration or increase protection of kelp forests, and we start to identify, I think, 3 main pillars. And the first is just that appreciation and support. So again, we might be big kelp aficionados in this room, but many people around the world just aren't even aware of a kelp forest, or if they are aware, they might even have a negative connotation to it as like a slimy seaweed or something that touches them when they swim or washes up on the beach and smells. And through this, then there's often, and it's beginning to change, so there's been a nice flurry of activity in the last few years, but historically, there's been a lack of funding due to this lack of appreciation and support. And with that, then there's just not enough money to do the research, to develop the knowledge and expertise that's required to conserve or protect kelp forests or to manage them effectively. And so as we start to think about what we want to do with our organization, it's addressing these sort of 3 issues. And so the mission statement for the Kelp Forest Alliance is simply quite broad. It's to advance the protection and restoration of the world's kelp forests and the benefits they provide. And you can think about this as we're trying to help people help the kelp. So we're not necessarily doing the restoration ourselves, but we're trying to be an important knowledge base or facilitator for groups doing restoration and protection for kelp forests. And so we're not for profit based here in Sydney, but we have partners in 25 countries, almost 500 people are now connected through the network. Now, I'll just take you very quickly through some of the work we've done in the past and what we're working on into the future. But we built this restoration project database, which you can view on the kelpforestalliance.com. And the idea behind this was to create a centralized repository of information about restoration projects. So where they were happening, how they were happening, why they were happening, who was doing them, what the results were, and importantly, what the lessons learned. So when people were doing restoration, the outputs weren't just locked away in a report that might get lost on a web server or in a file folder somewhere. But we'd have one central home for people to share information and learn about past restoration projects, but also upload their new restoration projects so we could continue to track the global progress towards this. So this is a bit of an older snapshot, but yeah, we do have about 14,500 hectares of kelp forest under restoration. And the size of that community has now grown towards 500 people, as I was saying before. And we put a lot of this information together very collaboratively. We like to do most everything quite open and collaboratively within our network. So this is a guidebook that we put together with 50 authors all around the world about the best available information for how to do restoration. It's meant to take that sort of sum of knowledge that we gathered with the database and through talking to people doing restoration around the world and turn that into actionable steps for anyone who wants to start doing a restoration project. So the idea is to, again, help those projects that are trying to do restoration. There's a lot of research and investment that's required to set up a restoration program. So if we can provide this resource, then that can enable projects to do their work more easily, hopefully. And as I was saying, we've now built a global network. It's about 500 people now involved in kelp forest restoration and protection. And with this, we get a really comprehensive understanding of kelp forest conservation activities all around the world. And then we can also work to increase knowledge transfer and collaboration between those groups. And so it's not necessarily just scientists either. There's businesses involved, artists involved, filmmakers, managers, community groups. Anyone really connected to a kelp forest is invited to join. And really, we celebrate those non-science connections through the network, so we can create those partnerships that might not have existed in the past. Nevertheless, we still have to break that awareness barrier. So we have a really lovely network of people who love their kelp, but we still need to think about how we can take that to the next level and create truly a global movement for everyone to get involved in kelp forests. So that's where we've come up with the Kelp Forest Challenge. And so this is a targeted call to increase the awareness, restoration, and protection of kelp forests all around the world. And I'll go through it very, very briefly, but I'm happy to chat more in the questions or afterwards. But we're including both laminaris kelp and fucalis kelp as they occupy very similar niche habitats in many parts of the world. We're using an IUCN typology for what sort of activities count as restoration and protection. And I think most importantly, or potentially most importantly, this is something that everyone can participate in. So you can pledge to restore 10,000 hectares of kelp or protect 100,000 hectares of a kelp forest, but there are also opportunities for really anyone to get involved to enable restoration. So if you're leading a local policy campaign, you can pledge to make that policy campaign to save your local kelp forest. We have artists who are pledging to create art related to kelp forest. We have, Seaweed Festival would be a great example of an activity that's raising awareness and showcasing kelp forests to the world. And so these sort of activities can be included. And then with that, we can show that this isn't just an activity or a problem for scientists or governments, but it's something that really all of society can buy into, and they can actually play their part and help the kelp. Our targets are quite ambitious. So for 2040, we've set a target of 1 million hectares of kelp forest restored and 3 million hectares protected. And if you recall back to the beginning, we only have about 15,000 hectares of kelp forest restored to date. So we need to, let's say, almost 50 times that effort in the next 17 years. And we're now working to do the enabling activities and actions and create strategies for how to actually achieve these targets and campaign to get governments to buy in and make those really large, meaningful pledges for protection and restoration of kelp forests. But to date, we only launched this back in February, and we had, I think, 20 pledges to begin with from 8 countries, over 40,000 hectares for restoration. And we also had, as I was saying, artists involved. So we had one woman create a song called Golden Kelp that she plays on her harp, and she's now touring across Australia, showcasing that song and tying it into the importance of kelp forests in Australia. We have a tech company loaning their expertise for underwater monitoring, photographers donating their photos for advertisement, media campaigns, running sort of awareness raising campaigns voluntarily. All these different ways that groups can get involved are we've yet to have, but I think we will very shortly have, I think in particular note to this conversation, aquaculture groups that are able to loan their expertise in growing kelp, potentially originally for food or for other processes, but then turning that into an activity that can be used to seed and stock new populations of kelp forests where they need to be restored. So as I said, I've gone through this all very, very quickly. There's quite a bit to it, but I'm happy to answer questions and would really encourage anyone who's interested in being involved in the Alliance or the challenge to reach out and give a shout, and we'll see what we can do together. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, all panelists, and see how we're all doing similar work, but not exactly the same work. And we have lots of interface. So the first question I want to ask actually follows directly on from what Aaron was just talking about. And it's a question that came in actually before we started, and which is what, for people who don't live right at the coastline or work right on the coastline, why is restoration of coastal ecosystems important?
Well, the way I start to think about it is, I have my kelp hat and I wear my kelp hat very proudly, but as I was alluding to in that first slide, kelp forests are really that integral part of ocean ecosystem in cool and temperate waters. Right outside the tropics, it's really kelp forests that dominate coastal ecosystems. And if you want to have healthy oceans, you're going to need healthy kelp forests. And that sort of comes back to all the benefits that you get from having healthy oceans in terms of climate regulation, food provisioning, a place that they might want to visit or simply be aware that it exists and can experience on a day trip. But it becomes, I think, also part of a larger movement that it's not just a single ecosystem that we need to focus on. That's what we're working and that's what we're dedicated to. But if you care about sort of the planet and ecology and equitable society, these are things that we need to address. And so it's not just a person who lives right next to a kelp forest, though there are 750 million of those people who live right next to a kelp forest. And they're major cities too. They're Sydney, they're Tokyo, they're London, they're Los Angeles, Seattle, Vancouver, Santiago, Cape Town. These are dominant cities in our cultural fabric that are right next to a kelp forest.
Okay. Leslie or Nancy, you want to add anything to that?
I would just also refer to, Nancy had a slide, take a breath of air, thank an alga, that's I think the biggest way to get people to care is like this whole, at the very least, we know we need algae. Yes, phytoplankton have a big role in that, but just the air we breathe and keeping life on, even in the Midwest, even in these places that maybe people will never see the coast. I think that's something that really resonates with people no matter what, is that, take a breath of air, thank an alga.
I tell students all the time that there are people all around the world saving their pennies right now to be able to come and dive here and swim here. And so if there's people around the world waiting to come and see this place, it must be special. I know I did when I was a kid. I didn't grow up with kelp forests, but I couldn't wait to come and visit one.
Okay, so there's another question from the audience, which asks what resources you can share for community members who are interested in getting involved in restoration efforts. Go ahead, Nancy, I see you lit up immediately.
Yeah. Call me. If you live in Southern California. If you don't, we can work on that too. But I assume our information will be available to everyone. Yeah.
Yes.
Call me. We'll talk.
Okay.
Call me on a digital line so you don't pay long distance. No, if you check out the kelpforestalliance.com, we have the restoration guidebook there, which is built to be an accessible document. So it does provide very concrete steps about how to do restoration, but it's also not designed to be technically difficult to read. So I think anyone interested in kelp forest restoration, even if they don't plan on doing it, but just want to know more about the process, they can read that guidebook and get a good understanding.
Okay. All right, we have some questions specifically for some of you. So Aaron, how much hatchery and kelp aquaculture is going to be needed to make these goals, these terrific goals that are, massive and global?
I think it's an essential next piece. So most of what we've seen outside of Japan and Korea for restoration has involved collecting kelp from a local stock population near where you're trying to restore it, taking it back to some small scale lab or makeshift sort of culture facility, and then trying to rear the kelp that way to transplant it back out. But that's very labor intensive. It's not scalable. It has negative impacts on the existing wild populations. So if we can start to shift towards local culture centers that have the strains available for restoration, then that can solve all of those issues and start to think about how we can scale this at a higher level. And I'll just touch very briefly, it's a larger subject, but with culture centers, you open the opportunities for more selective breeding, and then I can start to look at how we think about restoring and warming oceans. So if we can look at more warm tolerant strains of kelp forest, then culture centers can play a really important role in answering that question.
Okay.
I also need to interject there, because this
Yes.
is where everyone who's listening to this cast right now can help, because our biggest impediment here in California is actually our government. So the state of California, believe it or not, it took 7 permits every year for me to plant kelp in the ocean. Permits from the California Coastal Commission, from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, from the State Lands Commission, from the Army Corps of Engineers. I had to lease the land from the state of California to plant the kelp on. So please, if this is important to you, talk to your representatives and tell them that it's important and that we need to restore our kelp forest, the most important ecosystem on our coast.
Okay. Oh, Nancy, I have a follow-up question, and that has to do with the Cutting Green Tape initiative in California. And is that helping you?
No, it has no word. The word ocean is not in it. So we need a Cutting the Blue Tape initiative, because that was only for terrestrial work. I'm going to be fighting for the next 3 years to get a permit to outplant my abalone. It took me 3 years to get my last permit. And this is why Leslie's working in the San Diego Bay and Humboldt Bay, because the Department of Fish and Wildlife has no jurisdiction there. She can't plant kelp and do kelp farming out in the ocean because the state of California does not allow it. So please talk to your representatives and tell them that this is important to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And getting right to the heart of it, right? Because there really is this, the governor of California's announcement on that really, made me feel like, all right, we're going to solve the permit problem, but no. Okay. All right. So I want to, there are a couple of questions about businesses. So this is like really right up Leslie's alley, right? Which is, what kinds of entrepreneurial opportunities are there in kelp forests? And how about growing businesses in kelp? So what can you tell us about that? Because that's what you do.
Sure. Yes, that is what I do. That's what I'm trying to still do. It's always a work in progress with something that is so new in this country, at least. Aaron mentioned like kelp restoration and kelp businesses in other parts of the world. And of course, in Asia, predominant countries, there's, kelp aquaculture has existed. Kelp and seaweed aquaculture has existed for so long. So there, there's 2 ways to look at it. As it's so new here. There are just endless opportunities to pick where you want to start with seaweed. You know, do you want to become an entrepreneur who makes a delicious product with seaweed and brings that to the masses here in the US? Do you want to wild harvest seaweed? You know, that's an avenue that a lot of folks, especially in California, take because you know, permitting and regulation is so tricky right now. But I think, you know, farming it is such a good place to start, and it is getting easier to access waterways. And of course, we will not be successful in, you know, kind of bolstering ecosystems through seaweed farming if we're the only ones doing it. So there are lots of resources for folks to kind of start if you're near the ocean, to start that process. I mentioned Greenwave in my talk. They're still kind of my go-to, where I send folks who are interested in becoming more familiar with seaweed aquaculture, or maybe doing it themselves. So they're a great resource, but of course there are more and more kind of as this becomes more popular. What was the other part of the question?
It was really the related questions about starting businesses in to do with kelp restoration and kelp forests and growing kelp. Yeah.
So, you know, with kind of what I showed you earlier in my slideshow with seaweed farming, and this touches on something Erin also said, this idea of hatcheries and kind of seed stock for seaweeds is going to be really important. Of course, genetic diversity and healthy crops are going to be a really big part of this growing industry. So we want to make sure that what we're planting in ocean spaces is supposed to be there, and not some kind of crazy Frankenstein alga that shouldn't really be there. So the idea of partnering with universities and researchers to create seed banking techniques, that's a huge part of this industry that I think is largely untapped. You know, Holdfast is doing that, but more areas like that are also up for grabs, I think, to enter into. So
I would also add that some of the other episodes in this series and our previous year's webinars in the Blue-Green series really focus very much on job creation and entrepreneurship and products. So I think there are lots of resources out there, and always everyone wants to know how to get started, right? How to get started doing things, either to get started in restoration, helping out, volunteering, or how to get started in business. I want to turn a little bit back to our topic of restoration and bioremediation and helping the ecosystem. So what is it about growing seaweeds, you know, for restoration, or growing animals in aquaculture for restoration of kelp forests? What's it doing for the ecosystem? Like, I think you touched on it a little bit, but like being really explicit, what are we getting by planting these seaweeds and animals back out there again?
I can give a go, but you're getting a transformation, really. So you think in many seascapes where you need restoration, it's often urchin barren or bare rock, which is an ecosystem that has some function and provides some services and benefits to society, but they're generally quite low. And then you're transforming that into a really rich, three-dimensional, living, breathing habitat that produces oxygen, takes those sort of excess nutrients out of the water, provides that habitat for hundreds of animals, from tiny little snails all the way up to whales we see living in using kelp forests. And in between that, you have fishes of commercial, recreational, cultural significance. You have things like abalone, lobster. You have this whole suite of biodiversity and animals. You know, we have sea dragons here in Australia. You have sea otters in California. So truly just some of the most magnificent creatures live in kelp forests. And further down, you have a sort of cultural ties and connections to the sea. So people, Aboriginal Indigenous people in particular, who have lived on the coast for hundreds and thousands of years, have incorporated these ecosystems into their art, into their stories. And so you just rebuild that connection to the ocean that is lost when these forests disappear.
I'd like to follow up on that because about building community. So how do you, the work that you're doing, how does it build community among people as well as building the ecological community? That's for anybody.
I can speak to that since I've trained hundreds of people to work on this. And what I've found is that there is a lot of dismay and often hopelessness felt in our communities when we, especially if you're not a diver, if you're not a person that even lives near the ocean, you may hear about stories of our kelp forests decimated, and you live in Oklahoma and say, I don't live near a kelp forest, or you live in, New York, you don't live near a kelp forest. And so in my instance, where I'm actually utilizing the community to rebuild these ecosystems, I find that there is hope in that people can actually contribute to the restoration of these ecosystems. So they can actually play a part in, and after a few years of growing kelp in schools and having students come back from going off to college and visiting and saying, how is our kelp doing? That was the bridge that I said, okay, now they own this ecosystem. They will vote for this ecosystem. It is theirs. And so by building community around restoration, which people have done with forests for, 100 years, by planting a tree, now you have a stake in the health of that forest. And that's the same thing with the local kelp forests.
Okay, Leslie or Aaron, you want to add to that, how your project builds community?
Yeah, I can add a little bit on the, the seaweed as food piece, because of course, everybody that's alive today loves to eat. I mean, that's the thing that we build community around food, right? And in California, coastal dwellers, food is just, seafood is such a big topic and like draws community, a tight community all over the state. So, people that are interested in food systems, when you talk to them about the importance of kelp forests, like that's an instant, like it resonates with people, they get it. And so tying in the fact that if we're farming seaweed throughout the state or throughout the country, and we're able to, do that in conjunction with oysters and mussels and these other delicious, super low trophic organisms, like we can shift the way we put food on our plate. And that to me, I think is like one of the most inspiring things, is seeing people make the connection of like, okay, there's tuna and big tasty fish here, but then like this whole method of farming shifts us into seaweeds and bivalves. And that's a way different perspective on how to bring food to your community. So
I can maybe add one new thought that I've not really spoken to before and see how it lands and just try to tease it out a little bit. But I think it builds a sense of purpose. And so I think, especially in Western cultures, we've had a very disconnected sort of relationship with the environment, or even a contestant relationship with the environment. And there's been this larger shift to view that as a more sort of reliant or integrated, or there's an emerging shift into that sort of viewpoint. And so when you start to think about restoration of kelp forests or the ocean or ecosystems in general, you start to, I think, connect to the sense of purpose that you're helping to build something beyond just yourself, and you're helping to sort of restore a balance that perhaps once existed and that we no longer have, or we've gotten away from. And so, I've talked to, as I said, hundreds of people that are working on this problem, and they're all very purpose driven and very sort of cognizant of trying to do their part to give back to not just society, but to the environment and to ecosystems and to ecology. And so that's, I think, been a really sort of running theme through a lot of this work. It is the purpose and the passion that comes behind it. And that's a very powerful factor to bring people together.
Yes, I agree. I agree so much that the restoration is, by doing it, we're restoring something in ourselves and our own communities. And that kind of wraps us back around to the question that we have, which is a totally brass tacks question, is where does the funds come for this? How do we pay for this?
That's a
I
great
have
question.
some.
Go ahead.
We have a document coming out talking about this because we do want to be very mindful of, how do we actually make this happen? And it's easy to say, let's restore 1 million hectares of kelp forest and then just kind of walk away and leave the job to it. So it's a long answer, but there's a few different methods. So places like Korea, it's all government funded. It's just done as part of their marine management programs, and the government is behind that sort of initiative. And it's a big investment. It's about $30 million a year that they put into kelp forest restoration, and they've got a 20-year commitment to that. So that's by far the largest sort of funding that comes into restoration at the global scale. Japan has a sort of similar approach, but they split it a little bit. So the federal government will do 50% of the funding. The state, or what they call the prefecture government, does another 25%. And the local interest group, which is usually fishers, puts in the last 25% to do the restoration. Other sorts of things we can start thinking about are, really making companies or organizations that are causing these negative impacts pay for those negative impacts, and then having that money go back into not just kelp forest, but ocean conservation and restoration in general. So that could be releasing nutrient pollution into the water from agriculture. It could also even be fisheries. Fisheries often pay a licensing fee, but that's quite small in a lot of cases in terms of what they're actually removing from the ocean. So if you're taking something out, maybe you should be putting something back in. So start thinking more about these usage fees for companies or organizations that are benefiting from the ocean. At the local scale, there's you have, I think it's called the Pittman, I always forget on it, but it's the conservation tax you have in the US, where a little bit of money from like a tent or a rifle that gets sold is put back into managing and protecting terrestrial ecosystems. So we could think about something similar for the ocean. If you buy a pair of freediving fins or a spear gun or a fishing rod or something like that, there's just a little bit of money that's reinvested. And lastly, we're investigating this idea of restoration credits or biodiversity credits. So recognizing the economic value of the services that are provided for kelp forest, and then connecting those to companies that might want to sort of meet their social, ecological development needs, and having that money then go into supporting the restoration of the conservation projects.
Okay, thank you. That exactly answers the question, which specifically asked about other working models.
Yeah.
And I didn't even include
Briefly,
that.
yeah, it's a very common sort of concern. Where does the money come from? You can't get away from it. Okay.
Anything to add to that, Nancy? I saw you kind of starting to answer.
That was a great comprehensive answer, but
Okay.
everything from bake sales to fundraising, yeah, everywhere, anywhere I could find it is where it comes from.
Okay. So I don't want to, we're sort of running into the last 10 minutes here. So I want to make sure we cover all the questions that we've had from the audience. So always there are questions about food, right? Because aquaculture, people think about food. So if your projects are producing food that people eat, and what kind of food? Is it good quality food? So obviously Leslie is producing some food, right? Because you grow seaweed for food and other purposes, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question about, it's an important question about where we're growing, where we're farming, and what kinds of uses it can have, the seaweed can have. And so, yeah, one of the big reasons we expanded up to Humboldt is to take advantage of sort of the low density of people, the low inputs, anthropogenic inputs, to crank out some seaweed that we can sell as food for people. And there's also this huge opportunity to grow seaweed for food for other critters, like, we have a massive amount of livestock in California and beyond, seaweed, ungulates, sheep, things like that. They love seaweed. It's an important mineral rich facet to their diet. So, growing seaweed specifically for the livestock kind of industries is a huge thing, kind of around the world, not just potential here, but lots of other places. And then there's this great opportunity to take some seaweeds, for example, the ones down in the bay, that we were able to harness a bunch of nutrient-rich runoff from San Diego Bay, take those nutrient-rich seaweeds and turn them into a land-based fertilizer. So kind of taking nutrients that would be a problem in a marine ecosystem and making them really not a problem in our land-based agricultural sectors. So, definitely lots of different avenues. And really the main factor with all of those is scale. So you kind of need to scale up if you're going to be selling your seaweed for fertilizer for like pennies on the dollar versus, if you're selling seaweed to a restaurant for $10 a pound or something like that. So tons of opportunity there, but size of your farm matters.
Okay. Nancy, do you eat any of the things you grow?
Sometimes, but they are going into the ocean, so they're potential food source for other animals, but also for humans. So that's one of the permitting hurdles, of course, is to making sure everything is safe to go back in the ocean. So it all gets checked out by state pathologists before it goes in.
Okay. All right, we have just a few minutes left, so I just want to give you each just like 1 minute to say what you see as the exciting thing in the future, near future, for restoration and remediation aquaculture. Go ahead, Aaron.
Sure. I mean, I'll just plug the Kelp Forest Challenge. I think this is really exciting. Very biasedly, I think this is very exciting. But this is really the first global initiative that's put a face to kelp forests and has had such a strong connection. Again, we're at 500 people across 25 countries and continuing to grow day by day of people who want to save our kelp forests. And this has been almost entirely grassroots, right? We've had very little government support to date. And I think we've been able to achieve and put forward a really beautiful vision. So you can imagine if we actually get some UN sort of federal level funding and support, that there's a really exciting opportunity to work towards these goals, achieve these goals, and again, involve everyone. So we want that big support, but we want to continue to pair with this sort of grassroots movement that we've got, where we have artists, we have local businesses, we have dive shops. Anyone really is welcome into this fold, and we can sort of build that big umbrella and do our best to help the kelp forest.
Okay. Leslie?
Okay, yeah, that was really well put, Aaron. I think that the thing that's making me most jazzed about restoration and bioremediation projects, specifically with seaweed, is the people doing it and like the amount of enthusiasm that each of those people brings to these projects, because we all know it's a super daunting thing to get into the water and try to outplant algae and get that going. And I will say a plug for the Seaweed Festival, which people on this call should absolutely try to attend. It's November 4th this year in San Diego, California. So put that on your calendars and then go hear about all of the really amazing restoration and otherwise kind of seaweed projects going on in California and beyond. I'm a co-organizer with Janet. I help Janet with the Seaweed Festival, and it's such a cool thing. So that's my plug.
Okay. Nancy, 30 seconds,
Yeah,
and then I have to make an announcement.
I guess I'll just say that I've been waiting for 20 years for restoration and aquaculture to pop in California. So we can only go forward. It can only get better from here.
Okay, thank you so much. We're coming to the end of the hour, so I have to do the wrap up. And I I love this feeling that we're going forward with. And so I want to remind everyone that this is the first of 4 events in this series. The 4th event is a live event at Altasea, which is the open house at Altasea in the Port of Los Angeles. And Pacific 6 will be unveiling their new harvesting vessel as part of the Blue-Green webinar series. So be there, right? So make sure you check the Altasea website for registration for all the other events in this series, and come and enjoy them and ask questions. And of course, contact anyone on this call or Altasea if you want more information about volunteering, about being part of a global scale effort, about learning about how to start your own seaweed farm, or how to get involved in aquaculture in California. Okay, I think, because now we are 1 minute past, we really have to wrap. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Janet.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Leslie,
Thank
Nancy.
you for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Yeah.